In the unfinished symphony, Margaret, a 50-year-old woman trapped in the routine of a predictable marriage, is shaken by an unexpected attraction to Daniel, a younger colleague of her husband. What begins as a fleeting spark of desire turns into a profound journey of self-discovery, forcing her to question who she is beyond the role of a wife and what true happiness means. As she navigates the whirlwind of emotions, guilt, longing, fear, and hope, Margaret faces difficult choices that will lead her to redefine her life, her identity, and the love she truly deserves. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The clinking of wine glasses and the low murmur of conversation filled the elegant dining room. Margaret Evans sat at the long mahogany table, her polished fingers wrapped around the stem of her glass, swirling the deep red liquid absent-mindedly. She should have been paying attention to the conversation. Her husband, Richard, was explaining some dull office politics to the group, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Across from her sat Daniel Whitmore. Young, confident, charismatic. Margaret had met Daniel once before at a company function, but tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, his easy laughter, the way his eyes met hers and held just a second longer than necessary. Or maybe it was her own restlessness, an awareness of time slipping through her fingers like sand. She had never thought of herself as someone who could be tempted. At 52, she had long settled into the quiet comfort of a stable marriage, a predictable life. There was security in routine, in knowing how Richard took his coffee, how he arranged his socks in neat little rows, how he always kissed her goodnight, even when they barely spoke during the day. But tonight, Margaret felt something unfamiliar bloom inside her. Daniel turned to her suddenly, his mouth curved into an amused smile. "Margaret, you've been quiet all evening. What's on your mind?" Caught off guard, she blinked. She hadn't realized she had been staring. "Oh, just enjoying the conversation," she replied smoothly, though her voice felt too composed, too rehearsed. He chuckled, and the warmth of his gaze lingered. "You look like someone who sees more than she says." It was an odd statement, but it unsettled her. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass. Richard, oblivious to the charged moment, jumped in. "Oh, Margaret sees everything. She just chooses when to chime in." His voice was light, affectionate, but she felt the weight of expectation in it, the role she was supposed to play. The steady wife, the polite hostess, the woman who never made waves. She smiled, as she always did, and took a sip of her wine. But as the night went on, she felt the spark of something she hadn't felt in years, something dangerous and exhilarating. Desire. Margaret told herself she was imagining it, that she had simply misread Daniel's friendliness, that it was nothing. But as they stood in the foyer saying their goodbyes, he leaned in, just slightly, just enough for his breath to brush her cheek. "It was a pleasure, Margaret," he murmured, his voice low. "I hope we get the chance to talk again." Her pulse stumbled, and just like that, her world, once so certain, shifted ever so slightly off balance. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of Richard moving around their en-suite bathroom, the rhythmic shuffling of his slippers against the tiled floor, a familiar part of her mornings. She lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the previous night playing in her mind like a film on repeat. Daniel's voice still echoed in her head. "I hope we get the chance to talk again." It was nothing, she told herself. Just a passing moment of charm, the kind of polite farewell exchanged at dinner parties. And yet, the warmth of his gaze had lingered far longer than it should have. She forced herself to push it aside and went through the motions of her morning, slipping into her robe, brushing her hair, applying just a touch of lipstick enough to look polished but not overly made up. Richard was already at the breakfast table by the time she walked downstairs, reading the newspaper as he always did, coffee in one hand, toast in the other. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice measured neutral. He barely glanced up from the paper before nodding. "Oh, yes. Late night, though. I think everyone had a good time." She poured herself coffee, watching as the dark liquid filled the porcelain cup. "Yes," she said. "It was a nice evening." A safe response. A practiced response. Richard folded the newspaper and finally looked at her. "Daniel's a smart guy, don't you think?" Her fingers tightened around the handle of her cup. "Yes. He seems very self-assured." Richard chuckled. "He is. Some of the younger guys in the firm are either too eager or too timid. But Daniel has presence. Presence. That was one way to describe him. He speaks highly of you, she said carefully. Richard smiled, pleased. I should hope so. I took him under my wing when he first joined. He's got ambition, Margaret, and in our business, that's everything. She took a sip of her coffee, willing herself to let the conversation fade into the usual morning chatter about the market, office politics, and their weekend plans. But underneath it all, she felt something unspoken stirring inside her. It had been years, decades, even since Margaret had felt the heady, fluttering awareness of being noticed. She wasn't naive. She knew time had softened her once sharp edges, that the bloom of youth had long faded. But last night, with Daniel's gaze lingering just a little too long, she had felt something she thought she'd lost. The realization unsettled her. After breakfast, Richard kissed her on the cheek, habit, muscle memory before heading out the door. I'll be late tonight. Board meeting. Don't wait up. She nodded, already knowing the drill. And then, just like that, she was alone in their quiet, beautiful home. A home that, for the first time, felt just a little too empty. Margaret spent the afternoon wandering through the city, a habit she had developed over the years when restlessness took hold. She strolled through the park, watching the way young couples leaned into each other, laughter spilling between them as if the world outside didn't exist. She passed by boutique shops, running her fingers along soft fabrics, perfumes, leather-bound books, small indulgences that never quite filled the ache she never spoke of. She ended up at a cafe she used to frequent in her younger years, before marriage had settled around her like an invisible, comfortable cage. She ordered a cappuccino and found a table by the window, watching life move around her. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed. A message. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name. Daniel Whitmore. She hesitated before opening it. Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I really enjoyed our conversation last night. Would love to hear more of your thoughts on things we didn't get to discuss. Maybe coffee sometime. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A response was expected. A polite dismissal, perhaps. A simple "that's very kind, but I must decline." Instead, she typed, "That sounds lovely," and hit send before she could talk herself out of it. As she placed her phone down, her heart raced in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was nothing, she told herself again. Nothing at all. The moment Margaret pressed send, a strange mix of exhilaration and guilt curled inside her. She had always been careful, measured, never one to indulge in reckless impulses. And yet, here she was, accepting an invitation for coffee from a man who was not her husband. The logical part of her insisted it was harmless, a simple conversation, nothing more. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about the coffee. It was about the way she had felt when Daniel looked at her. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet street, one of those small, effortlessly charming places where time seemed to slow. Margaret arrived early, a habit born of years of being dependable, punctual, and in control. She chose a table near the window, smoothing down the sleeve of her blouse as she waited. Would he think she had dressed up for him? The thought made her self-conscious. She had taken extra care that morning, choosing an elegant but understated top, a soft shade of lipstick that wasn't too bold but still felt noticeable. The bell above the door jingled, and there he was. Daniel spotted her immediately, his face lighting up with an easy smile. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who belonged wherever he went. It was a quality Margaret had always admired in others, but never quite mastered herself. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting," he said as he slid into the seat across from her. "Not at all," she replied, offering a polite smile. "I tend to be early. I would have guessed that about you." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what else have you guessed?" Daniel leaned back, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That you're the kind of woman who sees the world clearly, who notices things most people overlook." There was again that unsettling sense that he saw her in a way others didn't. It made her feel exposed, but also intrigued. Their conversation unfolded with surprising ease. He asked about her thoughts on art, travel, books, topics she hadn't discussed in so long that she almost forgot how much she had once loved them. Richard never asked her about these things anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because over time the questions had simply stopped. With Daniel, there was curiosity, engagement. When she laughed, it was unguarded, unpracticed. And then, in a moment that felt both ordinary and significant, he reached forward, brushing a stray thread from the cuff of her sleeve. Margaret froze. It was nothing, a fleeting touch, a simple gesture. But her skin burned where his fingers had been. Their eyes met, for a second too long. She should have looked away, should have laughed it off, but she didn't. Instead, she felt herself drawn into something dangerous, something that threatened the careful life she had built. A question hovered between them, unspoken. And for the first time in years, Margaret wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer. Margaret barely remembered driving home. The cafe, the conversation, the brief touch of Daniel's fingers against her sleeve, it all replayed in her mind like an intoxicating melody she couldn't silence. As she turned the key in the front door and stepped into her house, the familiar silence settled around her. The polished floors, the carefully arranged furniture, the faint scent of fresh flowers from the vase in the foyer, it was all as it had always been. Steady, predictable, safe. And yet, something inside her felt changed. She set her purse down on the kitchen counter and exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. What was she doing? It was just coffee, just conversation. Nothing improper had happened. And yet, she felt as if she had crossed an invisible threshold, one that separated her old life from something unknown, something she wasn't sure she had the strength to resist. She walked to the sink, turning on the faucet, watching the water rush over her hands as if washing away something unseen. But the feeling remained. The thrill, the danger, the temptation. That evening, Richard came home late, as he often did. Margaret had already eaten and was curled up on the couch with a book when she heard the sound of his keys in the lock. "Hey," he greeted her, dropping his briefcase by the door. "Long day." She glanced up, offering a small smile. "How was the meeting?" "The usual," he said, loosening his tie as he walked into the kitchen. She heard the clink of a glass, the sound of whiskey being poured. "Didn't you have lunch with a friend today?" Her heart skipped. Lunch. You mentioned something this morning." "Oh." She forced a light chuckle. "Yes, just a quick catch-up. Not a lie. Not really. But not the truth either." Richard returned to the living room, drink in hand, and sank into the chair across from her. He looked exhausted, distracted. She watched him, trying to remember the last time she had felt nervous in his presence. The last time she had felt anything other than comfort. She should tell him. Should say something about Daniel. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because hiding it felt like the first step toward something that could be wrong. But the words didn't come. Instead, she closed her book, setting it aside. "Do you want me to fix you something to eat?" He shook his head. "No, I had something at the office." And just like that, they settled into their routine. The same rhythm they had followed for years, an unspoken agreement of familiarity. Margaret should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the phantom sensation of Daniel's fingers grazing her sleeve. And she wondered how long she could keep pretending she didn't want more. Margaret stood in front of the bathroom mirror, fingers resting lightly on the cool porcelain sink. The soft overhead light cast a golden glow, smoothing the lines of age on her face. But no light, no clever angle, could disguise the truth reflected back at her. Something inside her had awakened, and she didn't know whether to fear it or embrace it. Her hair was still slightly tousled from the day, and she absently smoothed a few strands behind her ear. The act was habitual, but tonight it felt different, like she was studying herself as a stranger might. Was she beautiful? She had stopped asking herself that question years ago. Not out of sadness, but because it had ceased to matter. Richard loved her in his own way, steady and unquestioning, and she had long accepted that the intensity of youth had given way to something quieter, something more practical. But Daniel, Margaret swallowed hard at the thought of him. His eyes had lingered. His voice had dipped when he spoke to her. And she had felt it, that flicker of attraction, that dangerous thrill of possibility. The same thrill that now sent a ripple of guilt coursing through her. She turned away from the mirror and walked into the bedroom, where Richard was already asleep, his breathing even, his face softened by rest. She studied him in the dim light, the familiarity of him both comforting and suffocating. What would he say if he knew? Not that anything had happened, nothing truly inappropriate, Nothing she could not explain away. And yet, the very fact that she was standing here, thinking of Daniel while her husband slept beside her, made her feel as though she had already taken a step she could never undo. Margaret slipped into bed, careful not to disturb Richard, but sleep did not come easily. Instead, she lay in the dark, her heart beating a little too fast, her body a little too restless, her mind playing dangerous what-ifs. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight of a choice she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Margaret had always prided herself on being a woman of reason. She made sensible choices. She followed the path of stability, the one paved with logic and responsibility. She had been a devoted wife, a careful hostess, a mother who had raised her children to be kind and capable. So why, now, did she feel like a woman teetering on the edge of something reckless? It had been 3 days since the cafe. 3 days since Daniel's gaze had lingered too long, since his fingers had barely brushed her sleeve, since the first quiet tremor of temptation had settled deep in her bones. And now, here she was, standing in front of her closet, hesitating over what to wear for an event she had attended dozens of times before. Richard's firm was hosting a formal charity gala that evening, a polished, elegant affair filled with men in tailored suits and women in tasteful evening gowns. Margaret had always found these events predictable, their conversations looping in the same polite circles. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Daniel would be there. Her fingers skimmed across a row of dresses, black, navy, the safe choices. But then, without thinking, she reached for the deep emerald gown tucked away at the back of her closet. She hadn't worn it in years. It was daring in a way most of her clothing wasn't any more off the shoulder, the fabric clinging, just enough to remind her that she still had a body worth noticing. She hesitated, then pulled it from the hanger. As she slipped into it, smoothing the fabric over her hips, she glanced at her reflection. The woman staring back at her looked different, sharper, more awake. A woman who still wanted to be seen. The gala was held at the Grand Marlowe Hotel, an opulent ballroom glittering with chandeliers and the quiet hum of wealth. Margaret moved through the crowd at Richard's side, exchanging pleasantries with people she had known for years, her practiced smile never faltering. But her mind was elsewhere. She could feel Daniel's presence before she even saw him. And then there, across the room, in a crisp charcoal suit that fit too well, his posture relaxed yet confident, Daniel stood talking to a group of colleagues. He was laughing at something, his expression effortlessly charming, but then his gaze lifted and found hers. A flicker of recognition, a knowing smile. Margaret felt a breath hitch in her throat. She should look away. She should return to the conversation at hand, not at whatever dull remark Richard's associate was making about the market's unpredictability. But she didn't. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself hold his gaze. The room continued to move around them, but Margaret felt as though everything had stilled, as if the careful walls she had built around herself had weakened, just enough for something else to slip through. And then, just as quickly, she turned away. Dinner was served, and Margaret took her seat beside Richard at one of the long, white-clothed tables. She listened, she smiled, she played the role of the devoted wife without fault. But beneath the polished surface, her pulse was unsteady. Halfway through the meal, Daniel appeared at their table, a glass of wine in hand, his expression warm. "Mind if I steal a moment of your wife's time?" he asked Richard, his tone light, teasing. Richard chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "By all means. Give her a break from all this dull talk." Margaret's heart pounded as Daniel extended a hand. She hesitated only briefly before taking it, letting him guide her away from the table, away from the neatly arranged world she had spent decades maintaining. They stopped near the balcony doors, the soft murmur of the gala fading just slightly as a cool breeze slipped in through the opening. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. "You look incredible tonight." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's just an old dress." "It doesn't feel old," he murmured. His voice was quiet, but she could hear the meaning beneath it. She glanced toward the ballroom, toward Richard, who was too engrossed in conversation to notice she was gone. "This is dangerous," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she meant the conversation, the way he was looking at her, or the way she felt like she was stepping too close to the edge of something that could undo her completely. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know." There was something raw in his voice, something unscripted. "Tell me to leave you alone," he said suddenly. "And I will." Margaret's breath caught. This was it. The moment where she could put a stop to this, where she could choose the path she had always chosen, the one that was safe, the one that was expected. But the words wouldn't come. She should say them. She needed to say them. Instead, she whispered, "I don't know if I want you to." Daniel's expression shifted, something unreadable, something dangerously close to longing. And before either of them could say another word, someone called her name. Margaret turned sharply to find one of Richard's colleagues approaching, his expression oblivious to the storm that had just passed between her and Daniel. "There you are. Richard was looking for you." She nodded, forcing her features into careful composure. "Of course. I should get back." Daniel didn't say anything, but as she turned to go, she felt his gaze on her, heavy and unspoken. And as she slipped back into the ballroom, back into the world she had always known, she wondered if she had already gone too far to turn back. The car ride home was silent. Richard, exhausted from the evening, leaned his head back against the seat, his breathing even. Margaret kept her eyes on the passing streetlights, her thoughts tangled, frayed. By the time they reached home, Richard had already begun unfastening his cufflinks. "Good event," he said absently. "You had fun." Margaret hesitated, her fingers hovering over the clasp of her necklace. Fun. She thought of Daniel's gaze, the way her skin had burned under it, the way her body had felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. "Yes," she said finally. "I had fun." Richard kissed her cheek, murmured something about an early meeting, and disappeared into the bedroom. Margaret stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, her heart still unsteady. And in the silence of the house she had built with her husband, she asked herself the question she had been avoiding all night. Was she still the same woman she had always been? Or had something inside her already begun to change? Margaret sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, watching the early morning light spill through the window. The world was quiet, suspended in that brief moment before the day truly began. Last night still lingered in her body like an aftertaste. Daniel's gaze, the soft weight of his words, the unspoken truth between them. She had barely slept, her mind restless with what-ifs and maybes. She was playing with fire. She knew this, and yet she could still feel the heat of it beneath her skin. Richard's footsteps broke the silence as he entered the kitchen, already dressed for work. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had lived in the same rhythm for years. Coffee, newspaper, a quick glance at his watch. "You're up early," he noted, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. Margaret forced a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded absent-mindedly, already scrolling through emails on his phone. The usual, the comfortable routine. "Big case today?" she asked. "Oh, yes." He took a sip of coffee, barely looking up. "Long day ahead." A pause. She watched him, waiting for something, some flicker of recognition, some sign that he noticed the way she was unraveling inside. But he didn't. And why would he? Margaret had spent years making sure she was steady, unshakable, a wife he could rely on. She swallowed hard. "Do you remember the first gala we went to?" she asked suddenly. Richard glanced up, surprised. "The one years ago." "Of course." "We danced," she murmured, the memory surfacing unbidden. "I remember the way you held me. It felt electric." Richard gave a soft chuckle. "I'm sure it did. We were younger then." Something about the way he said it, so casual, so certain, made her chest tighten. Younger. As if desire had an expiration date. As if the woman she was now, the woman sitting across from him, was no longer capable of feeling the things she had felt back then. She looked down at her tea, her reflection rippling in the liquid. Richard stood, grabbing his briefcase. "I'll be home late. Don't wait up." A quick peck on the cheek, and then he was gone. Margaret sat in the silence, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Something was shifting inside her, and she wasn't sure she could stop it. That afternoon, she found herself in the art gallery downtown. She hadn't planned to come here, hadn't planned any of this, really. But she had needed air, space, something that didn't feel like the carefully constructed life she had spent years perfecting. She wandered through the halls, letting the paintings pull her into their worlds. Bold colors, stolen moments, unfinished brushstrokes. There was something raw about them, something imperfect and beautiful. She paused in front of a particular piece of woman, her back turned, caught in motion. The strokes were heavy, rushed, as if the artist had been desperate to capture something fleeting. Margaret felt a strange ache in her chest. Had she become that woman, trapped between what was and what could be? Beautiful, isn't it? The voice sent a shiver down her spine. She turned slowly. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes flicking from the painting to her face. Margaret's breath hitched. "What are you doing here?" His lips curved into a slight smile. "I could ask you the same thing." Their eyes held, and suddenly she knew. This wasn't coincidence. She had come here searching for something, and somehow Daniel had become part of it. They ended up at a cafe down the street, tucked into a quiet corner away from prying eyes. Margaret should have left. She should have walked away before this became something she couldn't undo. But she didn't. Instead, she let herself sit across from him, let herself indulge in the way he made her feel like she was seen, like she was wanted. "Did you always love art?" he asked, stirring his coffee. She exhaled. "Once. A long time ago." His gaze was steady. "And now?" Margaret hesitated. "Now? I'm not sure." Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it's not that you stopped loving it. Maybe you just forgot." The words settled deep. Maybe she had forgotten. Not just art, but herself. She looked down at her hands, at the delicate gold band on her finger. "This is dangerous," she whispered. Daniel leaned in slightly. "I know." Silence. A choice hanging in the air between them. And for the first time, Margaret didn't know what she wanted more: safety, or the thrill of falling. When she got home that evening, the house was dark. Richard wasn't back yet. Margaret stood in the middle of the living room, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her fingers brushed her lips, as if trying to erase the ghost of something that hadn't quite happened but had come dangerously close. She had always thought affairs were loud, reckless things. Passionate, impulsive. But this was slow, quiet, a series of small choices that didn't feel like choices until they became something irreversible. She wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend she wasn't already slipping. And the scariest part, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop. The days after her encounter with Daniel passed in a blur, but Margaret felt each one stretch unbearably long. She moved through her life as if on autopilot, grocery shopping, answering calls, having dinner with Richard, smiling at the right moments. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling. Something she could no longer ignore. She was rearranging books in the study when her phone vibrated on the desk. Daniel. She shouldn't answer. She did. "Margaret." His voice was steady, calm, but there was something beneath it. Something unspoken. She closed her eyes. "We shouldn't do this." A pause. And yet here we are. Silence stretched between them, charged and fragile. "Meet me," he said finally. Margaret's breath caught. It wasn't a request. It was an inevitability. Her grip on the phone tightened. "Where?" The Grand Marlowe's bar was dimly lit, its leather booths and warm amber lighting exuding quiet luxury. Margaret stepped inside, smoothing invisible creases from her dress, heart pounding. She spotted him immediately. Daniel sat at a small corner table, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes gave him away. He was waiting. For her. Margaret crossed the room, aware of the way her pulse quickened with every step. When she sat down, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her, as if memorizing every detail. "You came," he said at last. She exhaled shakily. "I shouldn't have. And yet here you are." Margaret let out a soft, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." She met his gaze. It was. They sat there, the weight of unspoken words pressing in around them. Finally, Daniel leaned in. "What are you so afraid of?" Margaret's lips parted, but the answer stuck in her throat. Losing herself. Wanting too much. Crossing a line she could never uncross. Instead, she whispered, "Everything." Daniel reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. It was barely a touch, but it sent a shiver through her, a rush of sensation she hadn't felt in years. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he murmured. Margaret swallowed. "But it already is." Daniel exhaled, then sat back, running a hand through his hair. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, voice low. "And I know I should, but I don't want to." Margaret's heart clenched, because she felt the same, and she didn't know what to do with that. They left the hotel together. The city hummed around them, the cool evening air thick with the scent of rain. They walked in silence, side by side, until Daniel finally spoke. "Tell me something." Margaret glanced at him. "What?" He hesitated, then asked, "Are you happy?" She stopped walking. The question shouldn't have shocked her, but it did, because no one had asked her that in years. She could have lied, could have given the easy answer. Instead, she whispered, "I don't know." Daniel turned to face her fully. "Margaret." She shook her head. Don't what? Don't make this harder than it already is." Daniel exhaled sharply. "It doesn't have to be hard." She laughed, then soft, sad. "Of course it does." Because it wasn't just about desire. It was about loyalty, about the life she had built, about the fact that if she let this go any further, she wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Daniel watched her carefully. "What do you want?" Margaret's throat tightened. No one had asked her that in a long time either. She closed her eyes,